I am going to talk about three specific points. The first thing I want to talk about is the global level and the move towards multilateralism in many spaces. And when it comes to the space of fiscal decisions, debt decisions, tax decisions, there is a need to have a global architecture in place, which allows us to have discussions at a global level. But sometimes they take very long, and sometimes they're not as inclusive as we want them to be. And so there is a need to ensure that there are global spaces that are democratic and are inclusive as well. And this is because not only do I look at issues around debt and illicit financial flows, but I look at them from a human rights perspective. So for me, this is the first thing I think we really need to think about. And my General Assembly report this year in October is actually going to talk about the need to look at not only multilateral spaces, but also to look at regionally collaborative spaces, potentially at a continental level or at sub-regional levels within a continent, in order to bring together cohesiveness in how to take issues forward. And I hear this being reflected in some of the conversations already as we're going along. So that is my first point. My second point is that there is also a global debate around a multilateral treaty. And again, not just multilateral at a global level, but I think very importantly, also at regional and sub-regional levels. And the reason I say this is because even the economies in Africa, and there are over 50 of them, if we include territories as well, grow even further. There is the need to look for cohesiveness even in those spaces and to have treaties that allow them to come together. Now, these may not necessarily be geographical, they could be economically based, but we do house the largest number of LDCs on the continent. And so a lot of these need to come together and start having cohesive treaty negotiations taking place, as well as having understandings and viewpoints on how issues affect the economy. I hear the conversation that talks about the fact that we are so many of us in the same problems, but I think that even if we're in the same problems, each country does tend to be also very unique. And it's important that debt negotiations do not fall into the trap of being treated the same in different countries. And the nuances around it are becoming more and more exacerbated as the crisis economically is deepening, not only across the world, but is actually rippling across the world and into the developing countries slowly and progressively. The third point that I think is quite important, and this is work that I have been looking at, is the issue of IMF surcharges. Now, we talk a lot about these different issues, but one of the things that I see coming forward is going to be that surcharges are going to take place and they're going to deepen. These time-based fees that are applied on outstanding debt, usually 36 to 51 months after cases of credit that is outstanding, does compound debt. And we need to make sure that while we do, of course, prioritize debt payments, which is still required, the point is that these quotas are now going to go over the 180% mark, which means that the surcharges are going to kick in very soon. And while we are looking at debt and the nuances around debt and illicit financial flows, how this turns over and affects human rights and the living standards of people is in many different ways. The inability to access finance in a state means sometimes that they cannot contribute, for example, to membership bodies to which they belong, which means they lose out voting rights. Even this is a democratic problem that is happening in many international organizations speak. When you look at it domestically, we've already heard other speakers mention that debt gets prioritized and therefore human rights and living standards are not protected and maintained. Now, some people will say that we are coming out of a COVID crisis, but in the African continent, we have not yet vaccinated a very, very large percentage of people. And this crisis, on top of the other crises, food crisis, humanitarian crises, wars in other parts of the world, are all impacting the continent. And I think it is so important to have a conversation like this at this point in time.
go deep or firm.